All right, let's get started. Welcome to the dam removal webinar series, OMG, the sediment, the floods. If anybody has any technical issues, please call 518-402-8028. All right, and I will hand it over to the presenters to get rolling. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Craig. Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to DEC's Internal Dam Removal webinar series. My name is Tim Koch. I'm the Stream Restoration and Education Coordinator. I work jointly between Cornell Water Resources Institute and the DEC, and I'm based here in DEC's central office in Albany. This is the second of 5 planned webinars in this series. I mentioned last month that the purpose of this, why we're here, is to present the current state of the science and practice of dam removal using real-world research experience and case studies. Today's webinar probably has the best and cheekiest name of all 5, but it addresses 2 of the biggest concerns people have about removing dams, and that's OMG the sediment. There's just so much of it, and it could be contaminated. What do we do? And then also, what does removing a dam do to floods, the water surface, the hydrodynamics of flood waves? As we learned last month, thousands of dams have been removed across the country. Probably every single one of them had impounded sediment behind the dam. And while this is a super important piece of dam removal projects, one of my goals for today is to maybe get rid of the OMG, make sediment a little bit less scary, have a better understanding that sediment is not a dirty word. Sediment is not bad for rivers. In fact, it's a critical component of healthy rivers. And most importantly, I hope that we can have an understanding that we know how to manage sediment when removing dams, and yes, that includes contaminated sediment. We have amazing speakers today. From Save the Sound, we have Paul Woodworth and Laura Wildman, who combined have worked on over 300 dam projects and have personally been a part of removing more than 160 dams. Paul is a fluvial geomorphologist and Senior Director of Ecological Restoration, and we'll talk all things sediment. Laura is a professional hydraulic engineer, vice president for ecological action. She'll talk about the hydrology and hydraulics of dam removal, especially as it relates to those flood hydrodynamics. We also have my colleague Foster Valle from the Sediment Assessment and Management section here at DEC in the central office. We'll talk about sediment quality and contamination. Like last month, we're going to hold questions. We'll have 20 minutes of Q&A at the end. So you can submit any questions that you have to the Q&A function or the chat, whichever one. I think you should only have one. This is going to be a great webinar, some really important information. But it's Monday morning, so I want to take like 2 or 3 minutes to get us warmed up first. I will date myself with a little Monty Python reference here. I promise it's going to come full circle. But I do want to start by wishing my daughter a happy birthday. Having a young daughter, my life is saturated with Frozen movies from Disney, but I have to say that Frozen 2 is a pretty good movie for a big river nerd. There's like a mystical ancient river named Holland, and it has memories and it holds all the truths about the past. And a central part of the movie is the history and fate of a dam, one that not only disrupts the natural balance of the ecosystem, but has some pretty important social justice implications as well. So one of the main quests is to remove the dam, remove those past wrongs inflicted on nature and the native people. And so it's cool because I get like 5 cool dad points because I get to tell my daughter that I work on removing dams like Anna and Elsa do in the movie. So spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it or if you plan on seeing it anytime soon, maybe mute something here, but the dam gets removed. But this is where I feel like they could have done a little bit better job because they didn't do any analysis of the sediment before they started to remove it. The removal was not managed very well. They got a few earth giants to throw giant boulders at the dam until it came crumbling down. But this is not what a managed dam removal looks like. And we don't just get big excavators run wild on it until it crumbles. So managed dam removals do not result in wholesale release of the impounded water and sediment like you see here. There is lots of planning aimed at releasing enough sediment to restore the river, which has probably been sediment starved for decades, if not centuries, but not really so much or all at one time that it overloads the system. It creates negative impacts for people, the environment, or infrastructure. So this is not what a managed dam removal looks like. This is what a dam failure looks like, which does involve that wholesale release of all the water and the sediment and potentially contaminated sediment. So this is what happens if we hold up dam removal projects, or make them so onerous that funding runs out or the removal effort loses steam. And it is that sort of wholesale evacuation, including potentially contaminated sediment. So that's it for me. That was my intro. Happy birthday to my daughter. For the next 80 minutes, we're going to talk all about sediment and floods, how it moves, how it accumulates, the mechanics of contamination, and ultimately how to remove it. And we'll learn some really cool stuff about floods from Laura. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Paul Woodworth, fluvial geomorphologist with Save the Sound. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. That was a great intro. Hopefully you can see my thumbs up. You can see my slide and hear me.
Looks good, Paul.
Excellent. Great. So thanks for the introduction. Now I feel like I can move right through my title slide. You know who I am and what I'm here for. I'm going to be talking a bit about the modes of sediment transport, particle sizes, watershed zones, geomorphic equilibrium and the concept around that, and impounded sediment accumulation. And this is just a 10-minute warm up before we pass the mic over to Foster. So sediment moves in a variety of modes. First, and I think foremost from a geomorphic perspective, is the bed load. This is the heavier grain sizes that move by sliding or rolling or saltating, which is sort of hopping along the stream bed as water is carrying it and pushing it downstream. Saltation is like saltar in Spanish, so it means to hop or bounce. There's also the suspended load, which is the finer grain sizes like clay and silt, which are small enough to be carried. They never actually make much contact with the stream bed as long as the flow is moving. And then there's the dissolved load, which is basically ions and cations that are dissolved into in a solution. And all of these factors, all of these modes of transport, and all these grain sizes are an important component in a healthy river ecosystem. So I mentioned these particle grain sizes. They're broken down into major size classes that are pretty familiar terms, but they actually have numbers or dimensions that go along with that according to the Wentworth scale or the modified Wentworth scale. You may be surprised to hear that sand starts at about 2 millimeters or less. So that's like the size of a grain of salt. Gravel is from a grain of salt to about the size of a tennis ball. A cobble is about a tennis ball to a basketball. Anything bigger than a basketball, which is about 10 inches in diameter, is a boulder up to the size of a compact car. And then anytime bigger than a car, you're probably dealing with bedrock at that point. And so those gradations are broken down. And this is an example here of the modified Wentworth scale, which is powers of 2. And then, of course, when we do pebble counts, we take a gravel template and we pick up particles and we measure them according to that template and basically take a tally. And it's a really quick and easy way of getting a statistical representation of a particular feature in a stream or a cross section of a stream right there in the field. And these are very informative pieces of information and understanding the geomorphology of a stream. Sediment transport also varies depending on where you are in the watershed. And this longitudinal trend here is very pronounced in watersheds that have headwaters that start up in mountain ranges. Of course, not all of our watersheds do, but those watersheds that do have that, the headwaters are really steep and narrow valleys. They're considered to be more sources of sediment. They contribute a lot of sediment. That's where colluvium, that's the term for sediment that's brought into the stream network via gravity, not necessarily by flowing water. And they transport lots of sediment during large and less frequent floods. At some point, you move down gradient and you are in a zone that becomes referred to as the transfer zone or the transport dominated zone. And this is a high transport capacity. These are fairly geomorphically resilient reaches. They have little change. Basically, the sediment that's brought in is equivalent to the sediment that's moved out. So these are more gentler slopes than the headwaters, but they convey a lot of that sediment right down into what you get into lower reaches, where those lower areas tend to have broader floodplains. This is zone 3 or the depositional zone, and is also known as the response zone because they take in so much sediment, they're actually much more responsive to changes in sediment load. And by response, I mean meanders expanding, point bars expanding, so creating meanders and avulsion and deposition on floodplain, and ultimately out to a water body, whether it's a Great Lake or Long Island Sound or the Hudson Valley or the Hudson Estuary. You can get deltaic systems also. So those are those three major zones. This figure, by the way, is robbed from the Federal Interagency Stream Restoration Working Group. It's a great resource for some background on a lot of these topics and a lot of good figures if you're interested in reading more. So this longitudinal trend that starts from the headlands and headwaters and works its way down has a variety of geomorphic characteristics change in predictable ways. And this is a bit idealized, but to begin with, on the upper reaches, the bed material grain size, the stream slope, and the mean flows tend to be very steep and very high, and then they drop drastically as you move down. So there are diminishing grain size, diminishing mean velocities, and diminishing channel slope. On the other side of that equation, as you move down in a watershed, as you move down in the network, in the stream network, stream discharge, or the dominant channel forming discharge, tends to increase. The channel width, the channel tends to get wider, the channel tends to get deeper. And so those factors are on a rising trend. And then this other trend here, which is maybe a bit of a surprise to you, is that volume of stored alluvium. That's the volume of sediment that's stored in the system tends to increase dramatically as you get down into those lower responsive reaches. That's where a lot of sediment is naturally stored in the stream channel system and in the floodplain. The other concept that's important to understand here is the concept of geomorphic equilibrium. A researcher named Lane presented this back in 1955. He presented it in a really good visual communication tool, basically represented as a scale here. On the left side of this scale is a pile of sediment on the scale. On the right-hand side is a pitcher of water. This is basically representing how the flow of sediment and the flow of water are the two primary drivers that are driving geomorphic equilibrium. This introduced the concept of equilibrium. It hadn't really been fully understood. And he used this particular communication tool to basically explain the effects he was observing downstream of dams where sediment flow had been interrupted. So if we look closely at this scale, it's worth staring at it for a long time, longer than I can show it up on screen here, but it is definitely worth a good long stare. There's the flow of water and the flow of sediment. But there are secondary factors. As you tip the scale, the arrow in the middle actually starts to move. So if the flow of water increases and the sediment remains the same, that tips the scale and moves the arrow towards the degradation. That is degradation or downcutting, erosion of the channel. If it flips in the other direction, that's aggradation, that's settlement, that's deposition in the stream channel. So if we look at, say, a case study where there's a dam that's been recently constructed, that basically causes a decrease in sediment transport downstream of the dam. That tips the scale towards the water end. As the water is heavier, the sediment's lighter. That tips the scale towards degradation. And the response to that is a re-equilibration or a rebalancing that happens with generating a flatter slope in that downstream reach or bed coarsening. Actually, both of these things have been observed downstream of large dam trapping reservoirs and the like. In the flip side of things, say if you remove the dam and you release that sediment, well, that's going to tip the scale in the other direction and cause aggradation, and the channel will re-equilibrate back to a steeper slope with finer bed material. So dams interrupt this balance. Dam removal can tip that balance in the other direction, and over the long term, dam removals can restore this balance in a geomorphically balanced stream. So sediment accumulates behind small dams in fairly predictable ways. As soon as the flow with sediment enters into an impoundment where the water velocity is slower, the largest or heaviest grain sizes will settle out first. And so that happens at the upper end of the impoundment. The finer grain sizes have a slower falling velocity, and so they carry a little bit longer into the impoundment, and eventually they start to drop out. And so finer sediments accumulate closer to the dam. Some of the finest grain sizes, depending on how big the dam is and how long the impoundment is, might go right over the spillway. And this is pretty typical in a small dam situation where water is going over the crest and there's not much happening behind the dam. Say it's been obsolete or neglected or not really in much use. If it's a larger dam with an operation, say it's pumping water out for water supply or irrigation, or it's a hydropower dam, well, that can drastically alter the way these settlement patterns occur, especially if it has a low level outlet, for example, then that would change this alignment. But those are basic, that's a basic pattern between sort of longitudinally grain size difference between coarser on the up end and finer down closer to the dam. So here's a quick image of this. This happens progressively. So as the sediment accumulates, it can come in different waves and different events and different watershed characteristics, and that will lead to some stratification. And it is longitudinal, but it's also lateral. So it's sort of a deltaic setting, depending on how wide the reservoir is to the channel. And so that can cause the channel to shift laterally from right to left. And it's because of this pattern that you don't get, say there was a particular event that happened upstream of a source of contamination. You don't necessarily get a spot in the impoundment of a concentration of contamination. Contamination tends to be more in layers than it does in direct spots. That said, it's also distributed across an impoundment, so it's not necessarily super concentrated where it was from relative to the release point. But anyway, as you accumulate this sediment, eventually you get to a shallow enough condition where vegetation will become established, and that vegetation may start out in open water areas as rooted and floating, but eventually becomes emergent. Here's another example of a mill pond. This is actually in Connecticut. In 1934, this is how it looked as best we could tell from the oldest aerials we had. A stream channel coming down on the left-hand side of the screen, an impoundment off to the right. And then in 1955, you can observe some kind of alteration that happened. It may have been a dredging operation to increase its capacity. In 1970, we start to see the signs of what looks to be a little bit more deposition. The channel is now avulsed. It basically abandoned its old location, probably because of deposited material, or maybe because that channel was closed off. And this avulsion and this deposition expands out. 1972, there's a big change from 72 to 1990. That's a couple decades. 2004, 2005, eventually we were getting all the way out into the open water. 2008, and by 2011, we had almost a channel built out all the way to the spillway. And this dam was removed in 2015. So that's where I'm at. That's my first 10-minute bit. I hope that was at a good enough pace to handle this calendar, the schedule right now. Back to you, Tim.
That was great, Paul. Thanks. We're going to hear from Paul again a little later to talk more about sediment management at dam removals. That was a little primer on the natural ways that streams transport sediment. And we'll kick it over to Foster now to get into sediment quality and contamination. Take it away, Foster. Oh, and I will say too, don't forget to put any questions you have in the chat function. Thanks.
All right, can you hear me? Amazing. So, good morning, everybody. First, I just want to say thanks for having me, Tim. I really appreciate having a moment to talk here. And so we're going to be talking about sediment quality. I want to preface this with saying sediment quality has to do with both contamination and the idea that sediment might be clean, right? We're trying to assess what the quality looks like behind, so we can see either one. Even though I'm going to talk a lot about contamination today, it's always good to keep kind of in the back of your mind, okay, these sediments might also potentially be clean behind the dam. And so first, I want to talk about sediment contamination. What does sediment quality look like, and what does that mean? Well, contamination is basically the elevated levels of harmful chemicals, metals that disrupt the natural balance of the environment. The presence of these substances generally have an adverse effect to aquatic organisms and their environment, and water quality and human health and safety. And so I wanted to bring up a couple examples of these. Ones especially that we screened for in New York State. These are VOCs, SVOCs, pesticides, PCBs, dioxins, PAHs, and then priority pollutants, metals. And so that's like arsenic, lead, mercury, cadmium, metals of those sorts. And so you're probably wondering, well, how did we pick these ones to be specifically worried about and want to screen for? Well, they tend to be hydrophobic. So this means they're water fearing and they don't easily dissolve in water because of either their non-polar nature, and they're lipophilic, and so they're fat-loving, and they tend to be fat-soluble pollutants. So these are ones that are easily dissolved in fats, oils, and lipids. And so we're thinking about this when contamination starts affecting specifically aquatic organisms, and it could lead to bioaccumulation and eventually biomagnifying, right? And so these tend to be slowly metabolized when they are dissolved in fats and lipids, and they have a long biological half-lives. And so they end up negatively impacting, our immune systems. They weaken them. They can cause cancer and hormone disruption. And so we're generally worried about direct human contact and direct contact to aquatic organisms. Well, what does bioaccumulation look like? This is where a toxin will build up in an organism's tissue faster than it can be broken down. And it's often hard for it to be removed, right? And so biomagnification, they kind of work hand in hand here, where the toxic chemicals increase in concentration as they move through the food chain. The chemicals will magnify because you can increase, because as you increase in trophic level, we're presuming that the predator is consuming larger quantities of the prey, which may have been exposed to this contamination. So this is like us eating a bunch of fish that we had fished for in a lake or a stream. So specifically here, we want to be talking about PACs, also known as particle-associated contamination. And so these are contaminants that are associated with the sediment. So we're looking at contaminants that adhere strongly to sediment particles, allowing for these constituents to be trapped and deposited throughout the watershed, and eventually either accumulating or changing form. We're generally worried about fine sediment. So those sediment particles that are less than 0.25 millimeters are of main concern when we're screening for contaminants. Why is this? Because fine sediments represent a larger surface area to volume ratio. For the same total volume or mass, many tiny particles expose significantly more total external surface. A good way, I think, to visualize this is with a jar of marbles and then one really big marble, where they may have the same volume or mass. However, we have greater surface area in the jar of marbles with many small marbles than we do with one large marble that's taking up the same volume. These particles, because they possess a larger surface area, they provide more sites for contaminants like heavy metals, nutrients, and organic pollutants to adhere to. So they adhere via ionic, hydrophobic, or hydrogen bonding interactions. And so many contaminants, like I said, are hydrophobic. And so they'll preferentially partition out the water and instead adhere to the solid particles. I have a nice graphic here where we have a negatively charged fine sediment particle and a positively charged copper atom, right? And so because of these opposite charges, we know that opposites attract, and so we can form really tight ionic bonds between them. For contaminants that are not ionic compounds and don't have a net electrical charge, right? These are the neutral, nonpolar, covalent molecules. A good example of it is like TDT. These ones primarily absorb through low water solubility and an affinity for organic carbon. And so we see that usually a percentage of total organic carbon is higher in these fine sediments. So think silts and clays. So you may ask yourself, well, how did the contaminants get here? And so the main way we look at that is through the watershed and the associated contamination. And so the main factor we most commonly associate with the contamination presence, especially in rivers and dams, include the land uses in the upstream watershed and facilities at the dam and around the reservoir that end up resulting in the contamination being held within the impoundment or within the river system as a whole. These can be, of course, ongoing or historic. And so I provide a couple examples here. Some can be non-point sources. So this is industrial operations. So think smelting or mining can cause atmospheric deposition. And that can be a source of contaminants within the watershed and then resulting in our riverine systems. Urbanization. So in these high development areas, we have a high density of impervious surfaces. This increases urban and stormwater runoff. So let's think about petroleum products, right? They leak from cars. So if you have a high road density next to your stream or in your upper watershed, then you're more likely to see the runoff of petroleum products getting caught up in some of that urban and stormwater runoff and ending up in our rivers. And then agricultural practices, we see soil and surface erosion, and then lateral flow, we could get infiltration, right, from some of our agricultural practices. And that lateral flow directly can be connected hydraulically to the hypereuric zone, which is that area underneath the active stream channel, where basically the water sediment interface starts to meet, and that's where we can start getting some of our contamination. And then of course, we have point sources like wastewater facilities and industry that are pumping, that could be pumping contaminants directly from the source. And then remediation sites, whether they be downstream or not, they could be hydraulically connected. And so that's something we usually look for in your background kind of due diligence investigation. And we want to know also if there's any natural sources. I mean, we see some metals, we know that things like arsenic, right, are naturally occurring. So kind of understanding your watershed and the geology involved is relatively important. And so Paul already kind of alluded to the fact here about sedimentation within the impoundment. We understand that dams impede sediment transport and create these slack water environments. Well, these slack water environments create deposition. And so sedimentation generally leads to zonation and uniformity. And so I've created this little graphic here to kind of show what we usually observe. And so often we see the uniformity in impoundment sedimentation vertically, right? And so this means that when contaminants are deposited behind a dam, they're usually in these discrete layers. We'll see them. Hot spots, kind of like what Paul said, are seldom observed. However, can be present due to direct exposure. So we're thinking if somebody's directly pouring something into an impoundment, then we could get these hot spots. However, we seldom observe this. Something I wanted to make a point on was the difference between legacy contaminants and then some of the other contaminants that we screen for. And so like what makes legacy contaminants special are they're contaminants produced and introduced by industry that persist in the environment long after their introduction, and their uses were banned or restricted. So these are the ones that stick around for a really, really long time. And so some examples of those are PCBs, Deldrin, chloridane, DDT, dioxins. And so these are examples of things that are not found to naturally occur, and even in very low concentrations can be toxic in the aquatic environments, right? Something to think about is like, okay, well, PAHs and VOCs, they're volatile, especially low weight PAHs. And so they're relatively water soluble contaminants. And also they're easily volatilized. So the gas exchange. So once an impoundment might be drawn down or those sediments are exposed to the air, they volatilize off and they off gas. And so a good example I like to think about when it comes to legacy pollutants are PCBs, right? They were once widely used in the manufacturing of carbonless paper. They were used for heat transfer fluids and dielectric coolant fluids, except they were banned in 1979. However, we're still seeing PCBs in the environment, whether through it be poorly maintained hazardous waste sites, illegal dumpings, leaks and releases. And the thing is, these stick around for a really long time. So we're inherently more worried about them when we're looking and screening than we might be for PAHs or VOCs, even though those could also be concerning and impact the environment and water quality negatively. The deposition, fate, and transport of particle-associated contaminants. Contaminants can take many different forms. Obviously, they can be gas, they can be dissolved, they can be bound to the sediment. However, when it comes to desorption, fate, and transport, there's a lot of things that can go into what these contaminants might actually look like in the end. And so when it comes to desorption, right, then there's multiple things that can affect whether a contaminant might be desorbed from the sediment or not. This includes hydrodynamic conditions, So that's, either suspension or deposition. Sediment properties like granularity and cation exchange capacity, the sedimentary environments, whether you're in a highly saline environment, what the hardness is, the redox potential and pH, the accumulation of those sediments. And so we think about this with metals. Even at low concentrations, if you're seeing multiple metals in the same location, that can increase toxicity. And that's something that, we're worried about. And then this kind of volatilization that I already talked about, which was releasing gases into the air and the environment. When we're looking at fate, we've seen that some studies have found that many run-of-river dams have not significantly redistributed contaminants when they're released passively. And because we see that there's generally flow over those run-of-river dams. And so you're always getting some sort of sediment transport in those run-of-river dams. And so whatever sediment, contaminated sediment might be coming in, might also be going out. And so that's why we haven't seen as much of a significant redistribution. And then transport, of course, in transport, some are lost because of mixing and dilution, and also during the initial deposition. Something we can look at here are pathways and biological receptors when we're assessing sediment contamination. Well, what are biological receptors? They're the aquatic, macro, and micro invertebrates, aquatic species like fish and mussels. We can look at birds and wildlife, and then, of course, humans and how they're potentially exposed to contamination. And then, of course, the pathway, which is the way the receptors are exposed. You can either be exposed, there's three main ways I kind of look at it. One, through suspended sediment, through sediment deposits, and then through our dissolved load, right? And through suspended and dissolved load can directly impact fish because it can get into their gills. Like I said, they're lipophilic, so they break down in the fats, right? So that can also cause exposure to humans in the deposits. If people are sitting there eating mud pies, right? If a fisherman's sitting there and directly getting exposed to that contamination, then that would be a worry of ours, of course. And then finally, through the dissolved load, those would be impacts to water quality.
Got about 2 minutes, Foster. If you
Gotcha.
sign up.
No problem. We're really lucky here in New York. We have lots of guidance that we can work off of. We have our screening assessment for contaminated sediment, which is a Department of Fish and Wildlife and was released in 2014. We have our in-water and riparian management for sediment and dredge material, TOGS 511.9. We have our sediment cleanup objective or soil cleanup objectives set by DER in our regulations in 375. We have standard operating procedures for collecting sediment samples. And then kind of plugging this is what Tim and I have been working on, which is a new technical and operational guidance series document on sediment assessment and management for dam removals that we'll be talking about very soon. But with all of this, we're trying to presume the sediment is innocent until proven guilty. We have all these tools. Let's use these tools effectively. Dams are not waste containment facilities. This is huge. In the Times, they have these games where you can find the differences. They'll give you two pictures and they're slightly different. Well, I want everybody to look at these two pictures quick. What are the differences? I hope that it's generally pretty obvious. One is an upland disposal facility that is designed and created to hold contaminants and solid waste of sediment. And that other one right here on our left, that's a dam. They look a lot different and they definitely don't operate the same. And I kind of wanted to put some note on Scott Cuppett's quote here that ignoring and kicking the decision to remove a dam or an unmaintained and obsolete dam down the road because there's contamination is not a good or wise strategy. We don't want to be not removing these dams because there's contamination. There's great ways we can manage, and some of those management options look at in-stream management, mechanical removal of sediment, or a combination thereof. And so we can consider on case-by-case basis and kind of encourage downstream and in-stream management of sediment when the receiving waters contain similar or more contaminated material. We're going to go much more into this on the last webinar series where we talk about how our guidance document is going to propose management. However, I do want to make a quick connection to people who might be in the Speedies world and also be working on these dam removals where they're confused on, well, how can we allow some sediment to be released, right? And it's, well, in the speedies world, if a water body is impaired for a pollutant, the speedies permittee that's discharging that pollutant sets the permit to the limit that's set at the water quality standard. They don't have to necessarily clean up their effluent, but they're just set to not go beyond what the water quality standard for that area is, so they're not responsible for cleanup. This is similar in the dam removal world, right? Where we're not necessarily, unless we're hitting hazardous waste material, we're not cleaning anything up, but we're trying to match the environmental background. And I'd be happy to talk about this more in the Q&A if you have questions. But if we are seeing there's high contamination, then we have a couple of different options, whether they be beneficial use or disposal. We see beneficial use both on riparian and in the upland. And so if you have any more questions about that, I'd love to talk more. This is my contact information. If you click on any of these pictures here, it takes you to some of our associated web pages that can talk a little bit more about sediment assessment and management, and then what trends look like in New York State as of 2006 of marine and freshwater sediments. So thank you, Tim. I hope I finished up quick enough there.
Yeah, great job, Foster. Thank you. We are going to kick it back over to Paul to go more into the management side of things. So Paul, feel free to hop on, share your slides. We're getting some questions in the Q&A, so thank you folks for submitting. Don't be shy. We've got 20 minutes or so at the end, so we will address as many as we can. And, Paul, take it away.
All right, thank you. So now a little bit more about sediment management in the context of small dam removals, which are the most ubiquitous and common types of dams that we have in the Northeast. So I'll touch on sediment investigation. I see there was already a question in the chat about that, sampling and probing and survey of sediments. I'll talk about transport from dam removal, both what's evacuated or how it's evacuated from the impoundment, how it's retained in the impoundment, and then how it's transported downstream. I'll touch on the regulatory framework, at least at the federal level, and present some in-stream research, management research, and then hit on some case studies at the end. So fortunately for sediment investigation, or sediment is one of the largest factors in the cost of dam removal. And so that's why we spend a decent amount of time trying to figure it out. Fortunately, there are some guidelines that exist on the federal level that are put together by the Bureau of Rec, the dam removal analysis guidelines for sediment. They lay out a logical stepwise yes and no framework for evaluating sediment, looking at both the quality or the contamination, as Foster was just talking about, as well as the quantity or the volume, and then making distinctions between what's mobile versus what's the total volume. And they put things in the context of risk. Risk is the concept or the product of probability of something happening and the consequence or the intensity or the negative effect of that occurrence. And that risk will then drive the level of effort that should go into investigating sediment. So we use a variety of tools when it comes to sediment investigations, starting off with on the upper left-hand corner, a graduated range rod. This is a surveyor's type of equipment. You can use those to drive down into soft sediment to get a measurement of how thick the sediment is and then extrapolate across an impoundment to understand its total volume. We use Ponar samplers. Those are the clamshell dredge. You drop down from a boat in deep water and get a surface grab of the sediment right from the surface. We also use metal augers or steel augers, which can also be used for soil, but they have buckets that can be used to extract slugs of sediment out of that. Or we use my preferred tool and used in a lot of situations is a clear plastic tube that we drive down into the sediment, pull out a column of sediment. We have to observe any stratification if there is any, and then remove that sediment from the column and sample it strategically if you want to hone in on a particular layer. And when you can't do things in manual methods, there are some mechanical methods. So on the bottom center left is an image of a vibrocore set up on a tripod in a large impoundment that happens to be shallow enough to wade in. And that vibrocore is then driven down with a mechanical vibrator, pulled right back out, and then sediment was extracted from that aluminum core. On the upper right-hand corner is when you get into bigger jobs with bigger budgets, bigger scale projects. You hire a contractor that's a driller or a geoprobing type contractor. They've set out a barge, usually with a john boat mounted to the side of it to help push it around. Get yourself anchored in position, and then use those mechanical tools to either drive down through direct push, like hammer blows, or a rotary auger, and that can pull out full columns of 10, 20 feet of sediment that you can then open up. They're split spoons, so they open up halfway, and then you can sample those columns individually and specifically as according to a sampling plan. That's obviously a bigger budget effort for bigger sites. When it comes to surveying, there's the traditional total station and prism type survey that you can hire a professional surveyor to do. I will say a lot of professional surveys aren't used to this type of work, so it often needs to be guided by a consultant or perhaps your own staff. We've used regular GPSs and probes, but nowadays we're getting into RTK GPS, which is survey grade quality, so it gets really good elevations as well as the XY dimensions. And in some cases, you can use dual frequency sounders to get a bathymetric survey or get a top and bottom of sediment and use that to estimate volume or calculate volume across an impoundment. So sediment assessment follows a general framework where if you take sediment samples, you compare it to the standards that Foster has laid out. You also look at risk to the downstream reaches, whether it's threatened and endangered species or particular infrastructure, say it's a sewage treatment plant outfall or a water supply intake or something like that. You look at those factors, and if you're well below ecological criteria and human health criteria and you don't have any downstream risk factors, then that's usually a cause for advocating for in-stream management. A lot of this sediment's good to keep in the system, and that would be a case where that would be appropriate. Now, on the far right-hand side, if you are way above ecological criteria and way above background levels and human health criteria, then that becomes a cause for doing something a little bit more extensive, a little bit more mechanical. Taking sediment in the intermediate phase, it could be partial excavation, so removing some of that finest sediment that's closest to the dam, for example, putting it into the floodplain, capping it. In a worst case scenario, you could be talking about offsite disposal. Those are such big, costly items, they can be cost prohibitive. So that factors into a lot of these decisions as well. So when it comes to in-stream management, there's a range of options of ways you can do that. You can do a drawdown, a water drawdown before removal. This can be done on wide impoundments. They do it in a growing season in advance. That gives the seed bank in the sediment an opportunity to sprout, establish a vegetative cover, and that can minimize the amount of erosion and sediment movement that happens when the dam gets fully removed. Also, you can stabilize in place. You can move stuff in certain areas, perhaps armor it with rock to keep it out of the protected from flow. But those are kind of engineering approaches that you don't want to go too heavy-handed on. When it comes to full dam removal, a lot of these small dam removals can be done in a single event, so long as the downstream reach has adequate transport capacity, there's no downstream infrastructure concerns, and you don't have any downstream threatened or endangered species to be worried about. Now, when you do have any of those, you have inadequate transport capacity, or you do have downstream infrastructure concerns, or you do have sensitive and threatened species, then you start looking at staging the lowering or notching the dam, in addition to other factors to just deal with the infrastructure and the species themselves. So on the right-hand side are a couple photos of these various examples, and I'll touch on some more. There's been research on the ideas behind in-stream management. On the ecological side, the research is showing that conceptual models are predicting this, and this is what we're seeing when we measure, is that typically short-term impacts occur, and then they're followed by long-term ecological uplift. On the other hand, aside from the ecological, but the natural sediment transport, they're coming to really interesting conclusions as well. We've been viewing sediment as a disturbance or a pollutant that needs to be minimized. This is kind of codified in the Clean Water Actions since the 60s. However, these researchers are acknowledging that the natural disturbances associated with sediment are integral to river ecosystems, and even fine-grained sediment can be beneficial to the river conditions. So it's an important thing to remember that even fine-grained sediment is important for floodplain soils and important for interstitial fill. It can be nutrients for filter feeders. So there's value in all sizes, especially bedload, but often the underappreciated or feared fine-grained sizes. So when a few years ago, I was working in consulting for a consulting firm, Princeton Hydro. I had accomplished about 40 or so dam removals with Laura, actually. And I did a quick survey of them, just looking back, sort of a retrospective, and just said, how many of these are we doing certain types of sediment management? And a lot of them, we found out, 35 or so, were just strictly in-stream management. The others, the minority of them were active or some combination of in-stream management and active sediment management. And we looked at the specific techniques. We used passive revegetation in some, we used stabilization in a small number, planting, so deliberately planting an area. And then only in a small subset do we actually employ excavation. Was that really determined to be necessary? The vast majority, though, were in-stream management. So we know from our experience and from researchers like this that the mobilization from the impoundment tends to follow a predictable pattern. On the left-hand figure here, you have a pre-removal stage where sediment is accumulated behind a dam. You draw that down, you remove the dam or draw it down, and the initial thing in the process that happens is water starts to cut right through it, kind of like a knife. So that's the initial degradation stage. And then it goes from degradation to widening. Eventually, an equilibrium or quasi-equilibrium forms where that erosion is about equivalent to the normal channel, natural channel, or bankful channel upstream and downstream. And so you get a sort of an inset quasi-equilibrium stage. And researchers have looked at the rate of transport out of impoundments at a couple dam removals in the Northeast, in Maryland and New Hampshire, and found that sediment is really rapidly mobilized in that initial incision and widening phase, and they call that sort of the process-driven rates of erosion. And then it starts to level off as the channel is sort of formed in that impoundment. Even though there's lots of unconsolidated, unvegetated, still wet sediment onto the sides, the transport rates tend to decline, and those become more event-driven. That's erosion that happens during flood events and storm events, and that turbidity that goes along associated with it, I'll say in a couple slides to go, is often very similar to a natural flood event. So that's the evacuation of sediment. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of sediment that tends to stay, even if it's unconsolidated, because what gets mobilized initially is really associated with where the channel gets formed, where the natural channel reforms. And so you can get this sort of quasi-equilibrium stage where impounded sediment that wasn't there before the dam, but it basically remains after, becomes vegetated, forms a new floodplain that wasn't like that before. It's sort of a perched floodplain, and so it can become an abandoned floodplain terrace in some cases. Here's another example of this. Again, it's about the channel width relative to the impoundment width. When the impoundment width is narrow, just like the channel is upstream and downstream, I have some case studies to show this, then you're probably mobilizing all that sediment. But when the impoundment is much wider than the channel that will form up through there, or that used to exist before the dam was built, then a lot of that sediment can be abandoned and become a floodplain afterwards. Looking downstream, sediment is released in sort of those single event type situations. It's said to move in sort of like a wave, and that wave actually disperses and translates. As it translates downstream, it disperses, so it loses depth or height very rapidly as you move downstream of the dam. It's a combined process of translation and dispersion. So what may be 5 feet of sediment behind the dam when you remove it is really 2 feet 1 foot inches as you move downstream into the lower reaches. This other study on the right looked at a dam that was full of sand and gravel. Its pre-dam condition was kind of a very homogenized channel that was lacking in structural diversity and habitat value. They removed it in a single event. It was a wash of sand and gravel over the channel, also very homogeneous, but now with a new influx of sediment of varying grain sizes, fine to large. And within a year, the new channel started to carve through, a new thalweg, and new features started to evolve, and eventually an equilibrium channel formed that had better habitat quality than what existed when the dam was intact. A great example that I think carries over to a lot of the small dam removals we're looking at in the Northeast. This is kind of how the design process would look in a CAD file. This is actually a project in New York. The topography surrounding it, the red lines representing cross sections. On the right-hand side are two of those cross sections that show the channel we predict to form afterwards. The down cutting, or where it would equilibrate to at the invert, all the sediment that would erode as it gets down to that elevation, and then the adjacent areas that would be left abandoned as abandoned floodplain terraces. That calculation usually then gets put into a hydraulic model, and that helps inform our understanding of the downstream, of the post-dam removal conditions. When you show the channel getting cut down into the sediment, now you can start making predictions about the water surface elevations after the dam is removed. And I'll save the rest of that for Laura's talk after. Fortunately, there is a regulatory framework. Foster said you're lucky you've got good state guidance. You've also got federal guidance on this. There's the nationwide permit number 53 for the removal of low head dams that facilitates some of this. But there's also two documents that don't get a lot of attention. They're regulatory guidance letters, regals, they call them RGLs. The one on the left provided guidance on the discharge of sediments through a dam, either through breaching or just dam operations. It provides some background that also provides the geomorphic basis. It's important for you to understand, especially if you're interacting with Army Corps people, you can show them this document. It provides a legal context, and it helps to determine a de minimis discharge of sediment. It's a useful thing to understand from the perspective of the Army Corps. On the right-hand side, the Regal 1801 was determination of compensatory mitigation credits for the removal of obsolete dams. This is really important. It's basically saying there are lots of positive effects of removing small dams. This is how we would quantify those effects. They provide a good background on the effects of dams, and then the credit determination goes through a series of ideas. The area of the river that recovers, that could be upstream, that could be the impoundment, that could be upstream of the impoundment, that could be downstream of the impoundment if it's sediment deprived. They look at the riparian areas. You can measure as an area or a linear footage. They talk about T&E species that would benefit from the removal of the barrier. Obviously, the diagamous fish, that's a huge driver for a lot of these. Stream habitat features, and especially water quality, temperature, and dissolved oxygen, very well established in the literature now that dams are elevating temperature and declining of dissolved oxygen. And then obviously the distance to the next barriers upstream and downstream, or from the mouth to the next one up, are factors that factor into the calculation of how beneficial a dam removal can be. There's also research that's been done looking at specifically turbidity, the Clean Water Act, and the 401 water quality certification. We've encountered dams projects that imposed some pretty strict regulatory criteria and conditions on the permit, something like either no turbidity or 5 NTUs over background as a max. Those are really impossible to actually follow through on, no matter how good your contractor is and how complicated your water control plan is. There's going to be some turbidity impacts that are going to be short term, but not often, well below what the long-term benefit of the project can be. So this particular paper came to the conclusion that monitoring showed turbidity exceedances downstream of dam removals corresponded with upstream peaks. In other words, the turbidity measured upstream, generally within ranges observed during storm events. So the turbidity released during a dam removal or after a dam removal, it creates turbidity that's very similar to what's generated by that particular watershed during your typical flood or rain event. So, and that comes with immediate improvements in dissolved oxygen and temperature. So the water quality benefits impacts can be pretty self-explanatory or somewhat offsetting in a single event. So a couple case studies here. This is a stream actually in Pennsylvania, but again, it's very representative of streams we have in the Northeast. I can think of a couple in the Hudson Valley that fit this. It's a very narrow stream, or narrowly confined stream in a very densely urban area. Lots of utilities, lots of bridges. The image at the top shows the profile. The yellow shading represents the sediment that we probed and were identified as impounded sediment. All of that sediment was anticipated to be mobilized because this impoundment is as wide as the channel would be without the dam there. So this is a very small dam relative to the channel size. All of that sediment was evacuated. These are actually before and afters. You can't even tell the difference except that there's no dam in the right-hand picture. So mobile volume was equivalent to total volume, 100% migrated downstream, almost no changes to the channel itself, and no adverse impacts to the environment. Here's a very different site, a Save the Sound project, actually. This is in coastal Connecticut. This is a very wide impoundment relative to the channel coming in. Also heavily vegetated, 100, 200 years old, had accumulated tons of sediment, partly because the dam was leaky, but also because of different operations and the way it had been taken down and slowly over the years. But a lot of this vegetation, or a lot of the greenery here, it's not green, we're sort of leaf off condition here, but within that red line is the former footprint of the impoundment. Totally chock full of vegetation. This is a vibrant wetland system. It had emergent vegetation, a shrub, and it had some forest on the perimeter. There was big talk, a lot of concern about what we were going to do to that wetland condition, or that wetland situation. But we were able to basically assure ourselves and the regulators that we weren't going to drain it dry. It was always going to remain wet. We weren't going to mobilize all that sediment because the vegetation was already so heavily locked in and the gradients were low enough. So we came up with a compromise solution that excavated a pilot channel. You can see on the downstream right-hand side. We moved some of that soft sediment off to the side, planted it and stabilized it in place, left the rest of the impoundment unplanted, unmodified, no meandering channel cut up through there. It's a very light touch approach. And that is still 10 years after removal, a vibrant wetland just undergoing a slow vegetation transition as a result of some hydrologic changes, but really recognizable from its original condition. It still has tons of wetland habitat value. Oh, sorry, I just phased in here. There's the excavator in the middle out on a construction access way there that it built with stone, excavating material out of the channel, tossing it behind it. And that's an area that ended up getting planted. Here's another dam removal example from a long time ago. So this is a shallow impoundment, floating vegetation, duckweed and spatterdock and similar types of rooted and floating vegetation types. We knew this channel was going to be really small, meandering up through it. A simple removal, no sediment management, no planting needed to be done. The mobile volume was much less than the total volume. If you went out and probed all the way across that impoundment, you'd be gobsmacked about the amount of sediment that was in that impoundment, but really a tiny, tiny fraction was going to be mobilized just in the channel where it reformed. There was actually a legacy thaw weg running up through it, so we could predict pretty well where that channel was going to reform. So a combo of stabilization and in-stream management, passive revegetation, no planting, no seeding, and that's what it looked like afterwards. A new wetland system undergoing a wetland transition, but still a wetland, still regulatorily established as a wetland, and still providing habitat value. And then here's I think my final example of a unique situation. This was actually a large dam on a small stream in New Hampshire. It was fairly recently built. It had actually been built illegally, then failed, then rebuilt, and then it was still illegally built, and so they had to remove it. They were compelled to by dam safety, kind of a convoluted drama, but not a whole lot of sediment, a very low volume of sediment, much less than the total volume. If you had extrapolated across that entire impoundment, you would have thought there's a lot of sediment to deal with, but the stream is so small, its thaw leg was still there. We did almost nothing except remove that dam and watch what happened, and it recarved in areas where it had been before. You can see the stumps on those trees on that meander where it used to be. All that vegetation is native, non-invasive, and volunteer, and a very good example of how simple some dam removals can be after you've assessed sediment. And that's where I end it. That's Tim put in a plug for his kids. That's me playing dam removal with my kids. Those are couch cushions as dams and blankets as water. It's a fun activity for kids too. Pass it back to you, Tim.
All right. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, family business there. Thanks. That was great. We've got one more speaker, a couple minutes behind, but we still have plenty of time for Laura. So we'll have Laura Wildman talk about the hydrology and hydraulics of dam removals. And Laura, whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Sure. Do you see the full screen?
We sure do. Looks great.
Okay. My kids are bigger, and after 20 years of hearing about dam removal, they don't want me to stop at another dam or another river. They're like, Mom, do not pull the car over. So, but they were into it when they were little too. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the oh my God flooding side of it, which I've run into a lot. I thought it was genius that Tim started with Frozen, because I will say I was like screaming out loud when I watched that the first time, and people had no idea why. But it is a perfect example of the misconception of what dam removal is, that dam removal is somehow like a dam failure and you're going to get these catastrophic waves of water. So yeah, it did perpetuate the myth of flooding associated with dam removal. Let's talk about just basic terminology, hydrology versus hydraulics, often mixed up by people when they're discussing things. Hydrology is really the quantity and timing of flow. So it's the river's flow rates, hydrographs, peak flood discharges. When we're talking about all that kind of stuff, we're talking about hydrology, hydrologic cycle, all that. Hydraulics is characteristics of the flow itself. How the water moves, what's the water surface elevation, what are the depths, what are the velocities. So those are the differences there. We're going to be talking about both of these. I'm sure you're all familiar with the hydrologic cycle. Pretty common for our group of people. I am interested that a lot of lay people don't understand this, and a lot of their misconceptions associated with what's going to happen when you remove a dam, like a river's going to dry up, is their lack of understanding of the hydrologic cycle. So when we start out looking at a dam removal project, often we're looking at a feasibility study to determine if we're going to repair or remove a dam. We have to figure out the flows. So we often use stream stats, which is based on USGS gauges. We compare things from comparable watersheds. We might make a hydrologic model, especially if we're trying to do like conditions of highly developed in the future versus now type things. We use other reports that have been done, reported flows. And we have to look at the different types of flows for this. So it's not just storm flows. Often when we're dealing with like bridges and building dams, we're mainly looking at storm flows. What can they withstand? But when we're looking at ecological restoration, we have to look at a variety of things. So we're also looking at bankful flows because that helps us for the geomorphic characteristics of the channel. We're looking at fish passage flows to ensure that we can get fish passage afterwards. And this isn't just for migratory fish species, but all aquatic species we're looking at. And there's some good guidelines from U.S. Fish and Wildlife on that for migratory species. And then sometimes, especially if we're going to impact any kind of water diversions, we might have to look at low flows as well, low flow scenarios. One of the things we have to remember when we're looking at dams is that dams are designed for a specific design flow, as are levees and other types of water infrastructure. And a lot of times people think that only dams that are not well maintained fail, but that's not the case. Actually, dams fail that are well maintained if you exceed their design flow. And now there's more and more chance of that happening with climate change and changes in stream flow predictions, because dams were designed under one flow scenario, and now we're getting these peak flows and these events that are kind of more extreme than we had designed them for. You also have to remember that the regulations are ever changing based on a lot of this as well. So one of the things I want to point out for just adjusting to this is a period of record. First of all, a period of record of flow to really understand what's going on, hopefully is at minimum 30 years of continuous record. You may or may not have that. You also should be looking to incorporate climate trends for your region. In the Northeast, some of the suggestions are that you try to focus on from 1970 on, if possible, because that's when we saw kind of a stepped change in some of the flows, the magnitudes in New England due to climate change. And sometimes, though, you have to use a shorter period of record than what's recommended, because let's say if there was some significant construction since then. So you should be trying to use a period of record that's relevant to how much impervious surface there is in your watershed at this time. Okay, as we said at the beginning, playing off of the frozen thing, a lot of the misconceptions related to failure. They think of dam failures and they think of these flood waves that have come down through the system, and they think dam removal is going to have the same effects. This is a misconception because we remove dams under low flow scenarios and in very controlled flow scenarios, and therefore we don't run into that flood wave coming down like that. We're going to go into this. It also stems from the misconception that all dams are flood control dams. I remember when I first started removing dams in the 1990s, my mother and my doctor pointed out to me that you can't remove those dams. They're all flood control. And yet I was removing like 10-foot high old industrial dams, but their perception was that every single dam served a flood control purpose, which is just not the case. Now, there's only about 15% of the dams in the US that were even designed for flood control. And in New York, that's probably closer to only about 6% of the regulated dams based on the inventory that have any kind of flood control purpose, either solely or as a side benefit. So to understand which dams are flood control dams and which dams are not, or not flood control dams, which provide any level of attenuation or which ones do not, we have to understand a hydrograph. And I know a lot of you on the phone do understand hydrographs, but I'm going to go over it just quickly here. It's basically flow versus time. And I don't know, can you see my mouse when I put it up like this? Does that show up? No? Yes? So
Yes, I can see it well.
Down here, we see a rainfall event. So you have base flow in a river down here in the orange, but then you'll have a rainfall event. And you'll have a peak rainfall time and lower as it gets started and as it cuts off. And then you have a little bit of a delay before that really starts showing up as runoff in our river systems. So then you see from the base flow, you see it start rising. You get this rising limb of the hydrograph to the point where you get a peak flow, and then it starts receding till it gets back down to base flow. Those peak flows are often what we are designing for. And that's what we're thinking of. And they're different by year event, like a 100-year storm event or a 10-year. All those peak flows are going to be different depending on how much rain you got and what happened here. So that's your kind of standard hydrograph. And these hydrographs are affected by the amount of vegetation in a watershed. You'll see that if it's no vegetation, you get a peaky watershed. It comes off quicker, higher. And then if you have a highly vegetated watershed, it dampens that out. Same with soil type, clays versus sandy soils. So clay are pretty impermeable, so you'll get this peak flow, much peakier system. And then in a sandy soil that it's infiltrating, you'll again flatten that curve out. Same with steepness. Steepness affects it as well as land use and impermeable surfaces associated with land cover make a big difference. So when we're talking about a flood control dam, this is a flood control dam. Now, just looking at this is a flood control dam. First of all, if you're standing on the crest of this dam, your feet are dry. So that means that there's a good chance that there's some kind of attenuation associated with this system. And what you'll see is behind this dam, there is an area to fill up. So basically, this dam has some kind of low-level outlet. It's probably not just this one. My guess is there's another one somewhere around. But it has some kind of low-level outlet that allows flow to go through. But then during a storm event, as that available storage fills up, it's still throttling the amount of flow leaving. So while it's filling up, that's when you're getting flood attenuation. And once it is completely filled up, it's no longer providing any flood attenuation. So even a dam that provides flood attenuation will likely only provide it to a certain point, and then you'll have inflow equals outflow after that. So again, let's look at that on a hydrograph. Here's the hydrograph. This is the inflow hydrograph into the impoundment. Now, here's the outflow hydrograph. So what it does, again, this is on a flood control dam. So a flood control dam, it delays the flood impacts and it reduces that peak. It flattens the curve. You heard a lot about that in COVID too, although they weren't talking about this type of thing. But that's where attenuation is. So if we look at that this way, if you subtract those two peaks from each other, that's the attenuation that that dam provides. So you can run this type of analysis for any project to figure it out. This dam has no flood control, no ability. When you're on the crest of this dam, your feet are wet. All the flow coming into this is leaving this dam. It's the exact same thing. So let's look at the hydrograph for that. Here's the inflow hydrograph. Here's the outflow hydrograph. It's the exact same in this scenario. So you do not have any type of attenuation with something that's already full. Now, I have to give a lot of talks to communities, And it's very hard for them to understand the concept of like hydrographs. So I don't pull out hydrographs when I'm talking to communities, but I do talk about this bucket analogy. Okay, so if you had a drip in your sink at home, you would never take a full bucket of water and put it under the drip. It's common sense, right? It needs to be an empty bucket of water so it can attenuate, so it can fill up. It can grab that drip. You wouldn't put the full bucket under because then the drip would come out over the sides. That's the same kind of concept as a flood control dam. Is like typically a flood control dam is like a bucket that fills up, but it has a small hole at the bottom. So as it's filling up, it's still only letting that small amount of flow out the bottom until it totally fills and water starts going out the sides. So that's the live storage. So here's the outlet down here, and the live storage is everything above that outlet. But below that outlet, this bottom part of the bucket, filled up. It's just dead storage down there. Most small dams that we remove have all dead storage. They're 100% dead storage. All the flow is going over the top like this, and it's all dead storage. It's a full bucket. Does not have the ability to attenuate floods. This is an example of a flash flood. I think this one was in India. And now this is hitting a small dam that is already completely full. So I'm going to show you what happens. So here's the flood coming. Obviously, this doesn't happen as dramatically here. But you can see that that dam did nothing to attenuate that flood, did nothing to slow it down or anything else. The full amount of water coming in from the flood went through the system over the top and went down. Let's go through that. So again, just to reiterate these points, these are all dams that have flood attenuation. Every single one of these photos, you can look behind the dam and you could see where it would fill up before the dam itself, the crest of the dam, would overtop. Even this tiny little dam here done by hand has a little bit of attenuation. Probably not even a 1-year storm. My guess is that's more like a 1-minute storm it attenuates, but still it can attenuate right before it starts to completely flood over. All of these dams are examples of dams that have zero flood attenuation. So really, most of the cross-section of the type of dams we're looking at for removal, the old mill dams, the old industrial dams, really have little to no ability to attenuate floods. This particular dam, you look at it and you think, well, maybe this one has no ability to attenuate floods either, because I stand on that, my feet are wet, I can see all the water coming in, going out. But if you zoom out a little bit farther, you do see that there's a much higher earthen section of this dam. And because the spillway itself is a pinch point, that creates an ability for a volume back behind to attenuate. So you would have some attenuation on higher floods for this dam. So again, the analysis we do as engineers for this is we are given, we know an inflow hydrograph coming into the system. And then what we do is we determine what kind of available storage is within the impoundment, not the dead storage, the live storage, and we figure out how restricted the outlet is, and we create a rating curve for that. We combine that all together to then create an outflow hydrograph, and then we can determine the attenuation on that system. But that's why a lot of times I can visually look at a dam and say if it has ability to attenuate or not. A really amazing thing too, cool thing, and pretty obvious because natural systems are so amazing, is that vegetated floodplains and wetlands are amazing at attenuating floods too. We rarely calculate this, and by the way, the calculations are much harder to do because we don't have nearly as much good data on this as we do a lot of the other things that were meant for like engineered type systems. But these systems not only have storage sometimes, like in the example right here, but they also can infiltrate down in. They can slow the waters, infiltrate it with a vegetation. If we think of all those things that affect a hydrograph from the beginning, we realize that this type of system has the ability to attenuate hydrographs as well. A great example of this is the 8,103 acres of wetland system called the Giant Sponge surrounding Boston. And back in 2006, U.S. Army Corps had a report that estimated the flood control benefits of this wetland system to be $17 million a year. So now when we think about dam removals, this is actually an example that Paul showed too. This is the one up in New Hampshire. Here's it was kind of a large earthen dam right here. Here is the impoundment. But we only removed a portion of that earthen dam. We really only needed to remove a portion of that earthen dam. It had always been kind of a natural pinch point down through this area anyway. So we uncovered this large wetland meadow that you'll see in the next picture. And that is storage. So now, if you see the dam way over there, the earthen dam, there's the section of the dam that was taken out. All this now has live storage, available storage for attenuation, and we've got it infiltrating down into the soils as well and through the vegetation. Outside of attenuation, some of the other flood related things with dams is that pretty much all dams increase flood levels upstream. So when we remove a dam, we decrease flood levels upstream. So here's a stream flowing through this urban area. You put a dam in, you are automatically increasing water surface elevations. Hopefully you didn't build the dam high enough to actually do this and flood all these houses. But often the case is that it is increasing their flooding when you do get big storms. And then when we take out the dam, we're going back to that water surface elevation from before. So we're decreasing the water surface elevation there. We do this through looking at hydraulic assessments now. So a hydraulic assessment would be like a HEC-RAS model. We run a water surface profile. Paul showed a few of these too. We run this on every single dam project we do, whether it be a dam repair or a dam removal, but for sure with a dam removal. And we overlay, we run both with the dam and with the impounded sediment in place. And we run multiple storm events. That's what these different blue lines are. And then we take out the dam. We remove the impounded sediment. This is an important point. Sometimes people forget to do that. You have to at least have estimated what the mobile sediment is, take it out of the model to do it. Otherwise, you're not really modeling what it would look like afterwards. And then even in this, like the scour hole would fill with that impounded sediment. So you fill that in and you run this scenario and you can determine decreased water surface elevations in the upstream direction. And maybe if you're going to take a road or a house out of the floodplain, or multiple homes. But downstream, again, since most of the dams that we remove have zero attenuation abilities, we have the exact same water surface elevation downstream. And even some of the dams that do have attenuation, they might just attenuate a higher event, not regular flow events. So you don't see any changes in water surface elevations down here. And again, you can make all these estimates with a combination of good hydrologic and hydraulic analysis. And that's the sediment going into that hole. Another thing we need to talk about just real quick as I finish up here is the fact that dams create these places for debris during floods. And the problem with that is it raises the effective height of a dam in a very unstable way. So sometimes in flood events, you'll get this raising of the effective head of the dam because of the debris jam. And then you'll have pulses where these debris jams break, much like dam failures, and create additional flooding downstream that you wouldn't have seen without the dam in place, of course, or without the debris jam. One of the things that I find very interesting is that we're not great about telling people when they live within dam breach inundation zones. So because of that, dam failures often take people by surprise. So when we're removing a dam, we're removing that risk of these dam failures. Like we said before, and the frozen example is a good one, dam failures come with catastrophic flood waves that can come down and really damage a lot of property. Whereas a dam removal under low flow scenarios and a controlled event doesn't have any of that same effect. So a lot of times we are actually benefiting people downstream, especially because almost everything we remove is not a flood control dam, who don't even realize that they could be impacted by a dam failure. Another thing to remember hydraulically at dams is that low head dams, we think of really big dams as being unsafe from a dam failure point of view, right? But really low head dams, like this one back in the distance here, that killed 26 people, are often mistaken for beneficial, easy things. Like I can just shoot my boat right over that. I can fish right up near that. The kids are playing, you know, whatever. And they don't realize that low head dams create these drowning machines, what we call the perfect drowning machines, these hydraulic rollers. And these hydraulic rollers pull people under. So we also have this danger hydraulically of drowning at these low head dams. And the closer they are to looking almost like they're not there anymore, the stronger the hydraulic roller is. One other thing I just want to mention in final closing is that when we remove a dam, we can also impact the groundwater levels. Just like when the dam went in, it might have raised localized groundwater levels. When a dam comes out, it can as well. Because of this, you do have to be very aware of anything served by a well in the area. So if it's served by a well, and especially wells that were not built to code, you might remove a dam and you might impact that well. It might have to then be built to code to not run that well dry. So it's just another part of this all that we have to look at when we're talking about removal. And that's it.
All right, thank you very much, Laura.
Sure thing.
Okay, so we've got 8 minutes left. I think what we're gonna do, because we have a lot of good questions, so I think offline I might see if Laura and Paul would be willing to answer questions in writing, because we do have way more than we're going to be able to get to in the next few minutes, but we hopefully will get to at least one or two. So I think I will start with a question that's probably better for Paul. The question is, are there dam impoundment situations that have too much sediment such that sampling is difficult to perform? You're muted.
Muted.
Yeah, start talking. I have not encountered a situation where there was too much sediment that had to be sampled. Usually it's a characteristic of the sediment that makes it difficult. It might be really coarse grain, and so it was really hard to do with manual methods, and so it had to be something mobilized on site. Or it was really deep, the impoundment's really deep, and so it was really difficult manual methods to get down, so you had to use a contractor. I'm now dealing with a situation that is such deep water, even the contractors are having difficulty with kind of coring into it and pulling cores out. When it becomes such a large quantity, it can be hard to get enough samples to make you feel like you've got a representation, like a good representation of the sediment. But I'd say that's a minority of cases.
And we can always use barges on the bigger ones.
Okay. This one's for Laura. A question was asked about dams and dead storage. With dead storage, do they control debris movement at all in something like a 100-year storm?
Typically, the debris is not building up per se in the dead storage area. So I'm not quite sure I understand the link between dead storage and that. But so let's see. It says, do dams with dead storage, do they control debris movement in something? So yes, I mean, a dam can definitely have a debris issue in a 100-year storm. Matter of fact, sometimes even more so in the larger storms. And that's because they affect a larger portion of the watershed upstream. One of the things we've seen with dam removals is sometimes if there have been some huge storms in the past that took down a lot of trees, let's say, we might actually not just have sediment, but we might have a significant amount of timbers down, I guess, in that dead storage zone as well that we have to take care of. But yeah, in a 100-year storm, you could still see, depending on the restrictions at the dam and how the dam is configured, or if it's right next to a bridge, you can see these big buildups and you can see then breakthroughs of those big buildups occasionally and pulses through. So I'm not quite sure if I answered that suitably, but just because I wasn't quite sure the link between the dead storage, but because the dead storage, remember, is below the crest of a dam that doesn't have a low level outlet, or it's below the low level outlet on a dam that does have a low level outlet.
All right, here's one, I don't know, feel free to take it. For small dams, how does sedimentation compare to something natural such as a beaver dam?
I mean, if the dam is, about the height of a beaver dam, then you can have very similar sedimentation. I think beavers tend to aim for a particular place that we do not aim for when we're creating dams, mill dams. So the situations, the settings might be different. And then the beaver dam itself is, I know there's been some debate about, like, are small dams providing the same services that a beaver dam would provide, and I disagree with that. The beaver dam itself is a habitat structure. It also breaches during occasional rain events, then gets repatched, and so it allows periodic passage. But the sedimentation issues, I think, can be similar in a beaver dam situation. Of course, beaver dams do eventually get abandoned by the beaver themselves, and it becomes a beaver meadow after that point. So
yeah, and I would agree. It's the temporal nature of a beaver dam often blows out during a storm event along with sediment. So you don't, while it does have a buildup similar to a small dam, it would be like a small dam that has stop logs that you took out regularly and allowed sediment transport through and then put them back in. But I also agree with Paul that the habitat benefits, ecological benefits, and the transparency, both from fish passage and their temporal nature, makes beaver dams a real benefit in the system.
I think we'll have time for one last question, and it's going to be for anyone who wants to answer it. And it's related to the Thalweg. Maybe you could explain that, and also talk about how you assume the location of the Thalweg post-removal, and how much of an issue is in sizing through the process of removing a dam.
yeah, well, there's a lot in there. I feel like you rolled up a couple of questions into one.
I did, because I thought they were related.
Yeah, in many examples, we've been able to observe where the Thalweg was just because of patterns in the vegetation, and it was sort of accumulating on the sides of the floodplain, but clearly an unvegetated meandering pathway through it. In some cases, they are self-scouring. So that was the question I think that person also asked, is like, sediment can be accumulating in the impoundment while a Thalweg is still carving its way through. And that can be pretty pronounced when you do a bathymetric survey, or you do any kind of a survey in the impoundment. What was the other aspect of that? I just lost my train of thought. I know we've also looked at historic aerials and historic mapping to help piece together.
It was in sizing. How much of an issue was in sizing?
Yeah, I mean, incising is part of that process of channel recreation. So if you know where your channel is going to go, and or at least you have a reasonable understanding, or no reason to be super concerned about nailing that down, then the incising is a process that that will happen, and you can let that happen. If you have any reason to believe that the incision is going to go below the original stream bed, say due to some modification or some major constriction that was done, or some construction operation that destabilized the impoundment in a certain way, that could be a concern. That's definitely something you would want an engineer to look at. But in most cases, the channel incision is how that sediment's going to move upon removal. Laura, you can add to that.
Yeah, I do want to add, just in the sense that when we go out and take bathymetric surveys on these, we're not just taking top of sediment, impounded sediment. We're trying to get to the bottom of impounded sediment. Matter of fact, we say to refusal. And to refusal means to what the original riverbed or original floodplain was. Often we can very distinctly feel the difference between going into impounded sediment and then an underlying floodplain, or impounded sediment and then an underlying Thalweg. And then we plot those out, and we can figure out where the Thalweg was. Often these Thalwegs are still fully intact. These centers, these deepest centers of the channel, are still fully intact. They still even sometimes have the exact substrate we're trying to get back down to that's associated with this slope of the river or anything else. So typically it just cuts down to that substrate layer. But Paul and I have been involved in some projects where they did dredging, excessive dredging within the impoundment, and dredged below that fallway and below those original floodplain material. Then we have to really worry about, quote unquote, unraveling the system when we remove the dam, because we might have problems with that, or we might have seen that extreme down cutting below the dam because of that clear water condition where the sediment was behind the dam, and then we had a clear water condition, so we got down cutting as the system tried to react. And then that means that now the new base level below the dam is lower than the original thalweg. And so we might actually get a down cutting into that original thalweg unless we decide to, in a sense, kind of rebuild some of the channel grade that was impacted also by the dam.
All right, thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So like I said, maybe we'll answer some more questions in writing, get them out to folks. Laura, Paul, Foster, thank you all so much for your time and effort in putting these slides together and talking to us about dam removal. Excellent job. Thank you everyone for being here. We'll call it for today. I hope you come back on March 9th for episode number 3, where we'll talk about ecosystem response to dam removal. So thank you everybody. Have a great rest of your Monday.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.